Awesome. Thanks, Tejas, for the introduction. Hey, everybody, I'm CJ GAMMON. I work at Adobe as a creative technologist working on prototypes for applications and new product features. But throughout my career, I've been a web developer and designer. And so this interest in design and development has got me really focused on workflows and how we use these two things together to create really amazing workflows. And with the emergence of AI, I've been really interested in how we can use this to create websites, both the design and development side of this. So this led me to a project that I put together to kind of dive deeper into this, which I called Alien Interfaces, which I think makes a nice little acronym that allowed me to explore how far we can actually push this stuff, both through the design and development to create full-blown websites, also combined with some traditional tooling as well. So I started doing a bunch of tutorials, building out some designs and generating the websites from them. Here's some examples of what I've done. This is a design that I generated of a website, a web UI, sort of a mobile layout. And then here's the actual website that I put together. So you can kind of scroll through it and see all the little interactive pieces of it. This is another one that I thought was particularly interesting because it had some 3D organic geometry in it. And then I went ahead and put this one together using Three.js. It also allowed me to kind of explore now no-code tools, which have been getting really good at building out websites as well. So I use Spline to kind of experiment with how you could create something like this as well. And then this is another one that was pretty popular that I put together with a carousel at the top that sort of transitions between the different states and fades the UI. So I thought that was kind of a fun little interaction. And it was interesting too how these designs sort of inspired interactions and ways that you would actually build out the site itself. So I want to take you through the workflows and the processes I used in building these things. This is something that's kind of been evolving and I'm continuing to work on and kind of figure out the best way to use these things in application. I also want to talk about Richard Brautigan. So I'm a big Richard Brautigan fan. And if you don't know who he is, he's a beat poet from the 60s who wrote some short novels and a bunch of poetry. And in particular, he wrote this poem called All Watched Over by Machines of Loving Grace, which touches on humanity and nature's relationship with technology, which I thought was particularly fitting for this topic. So in order to kind of get away from sort of the stale AI stuff for a bit, I'm going to sprinkle this poem throughout the talk to kind of touch back to the humanities a little bit. And fun fact, if anyone knows the song Watermelon Sugar, it was actually inspired by the Richard Brautigan novel in Watermelon Sugar. So it's still impacting pop culture today, which I think is kind of interesting. Another thing I want to say is I am not a futurist. And what I mean by that is I don't know where this stuff is going. And I would be hesitant to trust anyone who says they do. We're all kind of on this crazy ride together. And I think that can be both exhilarating and scary at the same time. But that being said, I just want to kind of focus on where things are at right now, my experience with these tools and approaches. Another thing I want you to think about as we go through these different approaches is flow. And flow is when you're in it, right? When you're like playing jazz, when everything's sort of pouring out from you and you're doing your work and you're enjoying it and everything is just going smoothly without any real obstacles or hurdles. And I bring this up because I think in my using of AI, I think we can use it as an approach to sort of stay in this state and allow us to continue to retain the concept of flow as we're building and hopefully enjoying our work more and being more productive. So first up, I want to talk about AI for web design. I've broken this up into two sections, layout and assets. So if we think of the design as a puzzle, layout is the entire puzzle, right? The concept, all the different sections of your site. And then the assets would be all the pieces that fit within it. So for layout, I often use Midjourney. Midjourney is just the best at generating layout. It's really good at building comprehensive designs. These are some designs that I built with Midjourney. This one could be a great pastry shop website or something like that. This one is really beautiful vector illustration and UI. It has some really interesting infographics down below as well. This one could be a great children's illustration website or like children's author. This one could be a really cool website for a design portfolio, maybe a digital illustrator or photographer's website. I don't know what the heck this thing is, but I want to use it. I think this would be really cool to play around with, whatever it is. And I definitely want to build this thing. And that's one of the things that I think has been so interesting about generating designs is that it gives me ideas of things that I want to make. And I kind of see these and I get inspired and want to figure out how I would bring those things to life. Again, another interesting vector UI. You can just keep going. There's a ton of these things. It like doesn't stop. There's a bunch of cool designs that you can generate with these things. A lot of interesting 3D applications that you could build. The thing about this is it's really inspiring how many different types of styles of websites you can get out of these tools. And again, it just kind of makes me want to explore different approaches of how you would bring these things to life. So the way that I generate these in Midjourney is I'll often use a prompt like this. So this has UI, UX interface design, side-by-side, Behance dribble, beautiful color, creative app marketplace. And I want to focus on the different sections of this. So initially, I'll just start with what it is I'm making. So in this case, UI, UX interface design. Sometimes I'll use web design, mobile design, more broadly, just what is it you're trying to create? If you're doing a square generation, you can actually get multiple generations in one image. So you can use side-by-side for mobile designs and get two versions of it just to kind of get more generations and more exploration. Then I'll often just throw in some terms and popular web design websites where to kind of steer the quality of the image and generation a bit. And then beyond that, you can just get into more detail of what it is you're trying to make. What kind of website do you want this to be? Again, you can get as broad or specific as you want here. It's good to play around with these things. Sometimes you can actually get really creative, fun designs with a very broad term here. Because Midjourney works as a Discord bot, the way that you interface with it is much like a command line tool. So it has a bunch of parameters that you can adjust in order to get closer to the results that you're after. And these are some of the settings that I use. So stylize is really how creative or artistic the output is going to be. And because I really like really creative output, I'll just bump this to the maximum and use stylize 1000 often enough. Q stands for the quality of the output. So if you want more details in your generation, you want to set this higher. So quality 2 is the maximum. And then the aspect ratio will affect the dimensions of the image that you generate, but they also have a really important factor within the design itself. So the design will sort of cater to the type of aspect ratio that you use. So again, if you want a tall vertical scrolling kind of layout, you're going to want a vertical aspect ratio. And the version for V is actually one of the more important aspects of it because they do have multiple versions of Midjourney. I still have an affinity towards model version 4 for UI designs. I really like the output that it generates. The newer 5.1 is actually getting really good too, but they seem to be training and catering it more towards a photographic style. So you tend to get cleaner layout designs in the newer versions. I'm really interested to play with 5.2. That's coming out soon. So it's good to kind of go back and forth and test these out and see what version works best for the kind of outputs that you're generating. So assets are really important because these are the pieces of our website that we're going to create it. And if you're building something for production, it's great to generate a layout in Midjourney. But the thing is, even if the image looks really good, the assets and the parts of it are going to be really small. So you're not going to be able to use those in production, which means that we're going to need to upscale them. So I actually created this plugin for Figma called Dreamer that you can try out. And what it does is it actually allows us to upscale images. So here's a little image, and you can see I have it enlarged here. If I go ahead and try and make that larger, you can see we get all this pixelation. But if we go in and open up Dreamer, what we can do is actually select this image and click upscale, and it'll give us an upscaled version of this. So then we can take this asset and utilize it in our design and not have to worry about things like pixelation. So that's one thing you can do. Dreamer does a lot of other things, but I think upscaling is particularly useful for taking these AI-generated images and getting assets out of them. Another approach we can do is go right into Midjourney itself and take screenshots or captures of the assets, maybe the smaller resolution ones, feed them back into Midjourney using image to image and describe in the prompt what we want it to be, and then go ahead and upscale that and get new generations. So it won't be the exact image that you had originally, but this is a way to kind of play around and explore variations or upscale and generate higher quality images out of the parts of a site that it might generate. Of course, we also have Photoshop, which is just a behemoth of a tool for generating assets. So Photoshop has actually had a lot of AI features in it already, things like content-aware fill, but they also have really easy subject selection and remove background for isolating assets and using them for things like animation within websites. So this has been really useful. And the newest thing that they have is generative fill. So in the new beta of Photoshop, you can actually just make a selection and click generate, and it'll use the existing content to fill in that area and give you multiple variations of your content so that you can then outpaint and create a larger asset than you had originally. And this has been really useful for things like parallax effects when you need a taller image, or for responsive websites when something isn't wide enough to fill the full viewport of what you want. So I've been using this a lot. You can also just use it to generate new content and manipulate the assets themselves simply by typing in a prompt. So what Photoshop doesn't have in native support, there's a huge community of plugins out there. So if you guys are using Stable Diffusion, the web UI with Automatic 1111, which has a ton of rich features in it, there's also a plugin out there for that. Stability AI also has their plugin using their API, so you can interface with that as well, all right inside Photoshop without even leaving the application. And again, you can also create your own plugins. It's a very rich ecosystem out there. Beyond that, there's a bunch of other players in this game. There's really too many to play with, to be honest. So Firefly is doing some really cool stuff. Once they're out of beta, it'll be commercially friendly image generation. Runway ML has done really cool stuff with their Gen 2 video generation, text to video, which I've been playing around with a lot and have some cool ideas around generating video websites with Runway ML. Leonardo and Scenario are doing some really cool stuff for train your own model, as far as being able to take your own data set or assets and being able to train a new model to generate new variations of them. And other applications like Spline and Framer have also been dabbling and creating cool stuff with this as well. So I promised Richard Brautigan. So here's our first bit of the poem. I like to think, and the sooner the better, of a cybernetic meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. And so what I love about Richard Brautigan is that he's really optimistic about this relationship, right? And the key thing I get out of this part of it is that this mutually programming harmony, right? This relationship between technology and nature, technology and humanity. And this is something we've certainly seen over the past 10 years or so, is that while we create these technologies, they also have a huge impact on us and how we spend our days and our lives interacting with it. So I think this is something we need to be particularly aware of as we're continuing to develop and integrate this stuff into our lives. So next, I want to talk about AI for web development. And developers have been really quick to embrace this technology, I think largely just because web development moves so fast. You're always having to learn new tools and workflows and approaches anyways. And this just sort of taps into the way that developers have been using Google and things like Stack Overflow within their development process. So I've broken this up into 3 sections: learning, debugging, and coding. And for learning, I think here it's pretty clear how you can use these tools for learning. Things like ChatGPT allow you to just go in and ask questions about a particular topic. Now, you do need to be careful. Obviously, they can just generate nonsense. Often enough, they'll generate libraries or imports that don't really exist, which isn't too helpful. So you still need to kind of have an idea of what you're doing, and it's good to kind of go and validate things. But you can just go and ask it questions and continue to do clarifying questions and see what kind of code it generates, test things out, try it yourself, see if it makes sense or not, and then go ahead and dive deeper. So this is a really interesting way to kind of like learn things, or even if it's not code related, just what kind of approaches could you take to doing something or building something out that you're interested in making. Documentation, I think, is huge. So we've had tools in the past, like where we can generate documentation from our code, but often there's a lot of setup. You have to, it's based on comments, or you have to set things up a particular way. And the interesting thing about this stuff is you don't really need any of that. You can just take your code and dump it into these things and specify how you want it structured, and it will document it in a pretty reliable way and give you the documentation that you want. But beyond generating documentation, I think it also has some interesting ways that we could consume documentation as well. Because if you train a custom model, for example, on your code or your docs, people can just interface with it like a chatbot and be able to ask it questions without even knowing specifically what it is they're looking for, but just describing what it is they want to do and have it give back answers based on what you're looking for. So I think this is super powerful for things like documentation. I'm also really interested in this idea of rubber duck debugging. So if you're not familiar with it, rubber duck debugging is this idea where if you have a rubber duck or some inanimate object next to your desk, you can basically talk to it and describe the problem you're having as if it was a friend, right? As if it was a coworker. And in doing so, it forces you to think about the process and explain it in a way that makes you often discover the solution that you were looking for the whole time. And it's a lot like when you talk to a coworker and before they even answer, you already know the answer yourself. So I think this is really interesting because we can allow ChatGPT to sort of be our rubber duck. We can go to it with these questions. And beyond that, even if we don't come to the solution ourselves, just by explaining it, it'll give us options and probably give us some answers that we may not have even thought of. So I think it can be an interesting tool for that kind of approach as well. There's also this study done by Google Research where they took a bunch of comments that were given to pull requests within code bases, and they used AI to automatically try and resolve all of these comments within these PRs. And 40 to 50% of all of the preview suggested edits were applied by the code authors within this study. And I think this is really interesting because if we think about this kind of work, this is typically tedious work that developers will have to go back and kind of make these menial sort of edits to their code. And instead of doing that, they can lean on AI for this kind of thing and focus on new features and more interesting work instead of going back and constantly going back and forth with code reviewers. So code generation. This is the big thing. Obviously, these things can write code. They were trained on the internet. So one thing we can do with things like CodePilot is we can just have it write code for us. So you can make comments and have it generate code. It'll give you some options. I don't recommend doing this, not this way anyways. It is a bit more useful if you get very specific with your comments. But again, it's just going to generate whatever it thinks the boilerplate kind of code that you want is. I don't think that's a particularly good way to use this stuff. And it often doesn't really have context of what you're trying to make or your full application. So a better way to approach this, I think, is to create more modular components, little bits and pieces of code that you want to use within your application that you can sort of validate and confirm are correct. Because you don't want to just put things in there. You could create a lot of security vulnerabilities and you don't know what it's going to generate. So you need to know and trust everything that's going into your code. So a good way to do this is to kind of just treat it like you would Stack Overflow, when you know exactly what it is you want to make, but you might not remember the exact syntax of it, and just have it go and generate little functions or little classes and little pieces of code that you can then incorporate into your larger application to help you speed up your development process. So we can use it for things like autocomplete. It'll actually use your syntax in the way that you write methods or variables and try and incorporate that into things like autocomplete. Copilot is really good at doing this. It's really good at writing little modular pieces of code, things like methods. You can use it for commenting. So much like the documentation example that I provided, we can take our code and just feed it into these things and have it commented up for us. And similarly for unit tests. So if we want to test our code with a particular library, we can take bits of code or functions and feed it into this and have it write tests for us as well. So these are things that I think are really useful applications of this kind of technology within development. But of course, there's the elephant in the room. Like, do we even need to code anymore? Is this thing going to take over completely? What hope do we have in the future? So I created this little prototype that I wanted to kind of demo. And this is the scary part of the talk. This is the live demo. So you can see we have a website here, sort of a grid layout. We can go through here and see all the HTML in here, the CSS that sort of makes up this layout. And we can go in and let's see if we can ask it to do something. So let's say, so we're going to ask it to color all the items with the winter color scheme. And let's see what it generates. So hopefully it'll take all of these boxes and give it some sort of bluish, grayish tint. Again, we have to wait for this to generate because it is a bit of work. But hopefully we'll get something that makes sense based on the prompt. And there we go. So it was able to successfully color these items based on what I would interpret as a winter color scheme. If we go in here, we can look at this and see that it really just went through and changed all the background colors of these elements within our CSS. So that's cool, but let's give it something a little bit more challenging. So let's see how it interprets this. So we're saying create an AI chatbot with an input field that submits the text to the chat. Again, this may totally blow up in my face. We'll have to see. There's always a bit of randomness to this stuff. As Maggie explained, we don't really know what it's going to give us, but let's just try it out. Cool. So we have something that sort of resembles an AI chatbot. Let's type in here and say, cool, and it submits it to the chat. So we can continue doing it that way. Let's go in and look at what it generated. So here's the markup that it was able to generate. So pretty simple here. It's got our message area. It's got our input field with our submit button. We've got all the CSS that styles it here. So pretty basic layout kind of stuff. And then we've got the JavaScript, so it can write JavaScript as well. And this is a pretty simple application here. It's not, obviously, it's not creating a full hooked up AI chatbot or anything. But I think this shows that we can create some pretty interesting sort of use cases for scaffolding, testing, prototyping things, in interacting with websites using natural language for people that may not be familiar with coding to get things up and running quickly. So I thought that was kind of a fun way to explore where things are at for generating code. So back to Richard Brautigan. I like to think right now, please, of a cybernetic forest filled with pines and electronics where deer stroll peacefully past computers as if they were flowers with spinning blossoms. So this part of the poem, this poem comes in 3 parts, and this part is a bit dystopian, at least in my view. Like, I don't really want to live in a world where deer are strolling past computers that are laying on the ground. That seems a bit post-apocalyptic. But I do think it talks to the fact that we tend to integrate technology into our lives in such a seamless and sort of transparent way that we don't often take a step back and think about it. And particularly with this technology, I think it's very important for us to be very conscious of how we're integrating it into our lives and into our workflows, because I think there are going to be big repercussions, down the road if we don't do it in the right way. So is there more? Of course, we've talked about design, how you can use these things to design websites and the workflows that way. We've talked about development and how engineers are embracing this technology. But we also have things like APIs. So you can build your own applications with this technology and build your own workflows and tools and customize these things to fit your needs in a very specific way. Fine-tuning, you can also train models. And I think this is something that's going to become more and more popular as it becomes cheaper and easier to do, where we're going to have people creating their own models, both on their designs and on their code, to be able to expedite their workflows and create and work in a more efficient manner. We're also starting to see a lot of this AI content make its way into the web in a really interesting way as well. So with things like social media, you've probably seen some of these talking head videos that are generated using DID and Midjourney, but we're just going to see more and more of this stuff, especially as the technology gets better and better. And I think that could have some serious repercussions, not only for people posting and creating the content, pushing content to the web, but also for web developers and what that means for the future of the web and the kinds of applications and tools that we're going to have to make. So if you go too deep down this rabbit hole, it can get a little concerning and dystopian. Again, I am not a futurist. I don't really know where this stuff is going. I have my own concerns, but I also have some hopes and aspirations as well. And in order to kind of communicate that, I wanted to share with you this little website that I had built a while ago. So this is a website that I built mostly for my kids as a little sort of playground for them to move around and explore. And you can see it has these little characters that you can interact with. And every day there's a new little activity that you can do. So it's Tuesday, so this is Taco Tuesday. And the reason I bring this up is because I think this is kind of a fun little application, but it was actually a lot of work to do this, and includes a physics engine. It also has a lot of like sprite rendering. And every day that you visit it, and even based on the time you visit it, it changes. So there's a lot that kind of went into this. And I don't think we see a lot of websites that kind of really push the limits or really push the web in new directions that often. And my hope is that as AI makes it easier to build more complicated things, as it sort of lowers that bar, that people will start to both design and develop newer kinds of applications and really push the web into a more interesting and hopefully better place overall. So I also want to emphasize that this is a tool. We don't have to use these. I think it's important for us to kind of focus on what it is we like doing as far as our passion, our jobs, and lean on AI in the areas that we don't enjoy as much, in the places where we can automate the things that we don't like. And I think we get to decide how we use this stuff. That's the key thing I want you kind of take away from this. So I want to finish up the Richard Brautigan poem where he says, "I like to think it has to be of a cybernetic ecology where we are free of our labors and joined back to nature, returned to our mammal brothers and sisters, and all watched over by machines of loving grace." So, I mean, there's a few ways to interpret this whole poem, but I think this part kind of talks to the ecology and being free of our labors, like the economic implications of it, which is kind of the overarching question here of like, well, how is this going to change our jobs? How is it's going to impact our jobs? And the truth is, like, our jobs are always changing. We're always learning new technologies. I think people are particularly more concerned with this technology just because of the implications that it has. But I think this kind of touches on the question of like, what value do we bring to our jobs? And I think we often underestimate this in general. I think we tend to think of this in terms of like quantitative value, like our actual output in like the designs that we generate or the code that we write. but I think we bring a lot of other value to this too, the kind of squishy things and the social things and all these other things that we bring to our jobs. And the fact is, as I've been playing with this stuff more and more, I'm actually more optimistic in the value that our past experiences and our existing knowledge just gets compounded with our abilities to use this technology in an efficient and useful manner. So that's it for me. I'm CJ GAMMON on all social media. My hope is that you can kind of see a little bit of where I've been playing around with this technology and where it's kind of heading in hopefully a useful and practical way. But it's exciting times. I'm going to continue to play with it and kind of see, how it evolves and how we can continue to create websites and web content with this kind of tech. So thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, CJ. I'm kind of taking over here at this point from Tejas. Hello, everyone, from a very loud neighborhood in Shoreditch in London. CJ, thank you so much for the wonderful session. You know what? I really love the fact that you actually emphasized one thing that has been very important to me as well. And that's when we actually started thinking about AI, we had the ChatGPT coming up. We had this feeling like, oh, we have this thing that we can play with, like a demo almost thing. And you have this prompt and you can do whatever you want with it, right? And it's incredible to see this really moving to places where we really take it and say, what if we did this with that and did this with that? Instead of just saying, let's play with it, just as a demo, let's see how we can apply it to our work. And I'm really, really excited to see you coming in and kind of sharing your insights on that. But with it comes one thing that also came up as a question in here. So when we're speaking about designing with AI, and this is a question that came from in the chat, is the risk of designing like this that it really becomes about the pretty picture again, rather than focusing on solving a user's problem?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. I mean, obviously, I think there's a balance, right? And I think obviously you want to solve a problem. You're catering either to a customer or a particular user that might have a use case. But I think as designers too, we're always trying to like make things interesting, make it more engaging, and explore different variations. And so the way that I see this is just a tool to like explore more variations at once. I don't think, if you want to just not use it, like that's totally fine. You can just build whatever you want. But if you want to kind of use this as sort of a batch tool or way to kind of like get through like writer's block, so to speak, and kind of see what else could be out there that you may not have thought of, I think it kind of fits in that category.
Right.
So
right.
That's kind of how I like to see it.
Yeah, that does make sense. I think in many ways it's really more about what we do with it, right? And how we can actually end up using it. I actually wasn't aware about all these fine little things that you can actually do with Midjourney with like little parameters and all. That's actually quite incredible to see. This brings us to another question that also came up. So in the world in which we're living then, do you feel like we're moving to the world where we're going to have AI generating design, or is it still going to be like kind of a co-pilot?
Right.
Do you see that? And at which point will we be seeing more people kind of saying, okay, I'm a co-pilot now for my AI machine? Are we there? Or is it always going to be, or AI is probably going to be a co-pilot?
Yeah, so that's
What's your take on this
question? I think it's always interesting to me because there are actually artists out there who still use like paint and like classical tools. And while it may not be like the common thing, I think those things where like our process sometimes impacts the outcome. Like the way that we create things sometimes has an effect, whether we realize it or not, on what it is we're creating. So I think as designers, you kind of have to choose and decide how much you want to integrate this thing into your workflow and like where it makes the most sense. Because at the end of the day, it's the end product, right? It's like what it was you're delivering to your customers. And I think just figuring out that balance and figuring out the best way for you to produce that is really the key thing here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Right. Well, we have so many questions that came up in here. I don't even know where to start. I mean, maybe just two more, and then we can actually move on to the next session as well. So AL315 asks, if we were to use large language models to build a commercial website or assets, how nervous should we be that we're feeding our data, website copy, images, etc., into these LLMs?
So this is pertaining to like the copy as far as like the content within LLMs
so.
versus like designs. Yeah, so I mean, obviously anything you feed into ChatGPT they have access to. It is a very public service. So you definitely want to be aware of that when you're using these models. That I think even in their terms of service, they say that they're training on the content that you provide it. So again, I would not put any proprietary or anything like
Right.
that in any of these models at all.
Okay, reasonable. It's also interesting that I'm always thinking about us trying to feed machines like language models with everything, like all the data, bring in all the data that we can gather. And I'm wondering, should we be more selective? I mean, if I think about the interface that you have built, right, actually building up a page or changing the color palette and all of that, right? Maybe we should feed it only, let's say, accessible color palettes and semantic markup and BOOCAG double 2.1 AAA guidelines and all of that. So it can kind of figure out a nice, well, baseline, so to say, but an accessible baseline out of the box. I think like we often have this obsession almost to really feed as much data as we can so the system can actually make predictable, good predictions and generate good stuff. But should we be more restrictive about that? Should we make our large language models smaller?
So I think that's where things like fine tuning and like even like they've even seen that like I think having more quality data is actually more valuable in some
Right,
cases.
right,
So that I mean that kind of speaks to what you're saying. Like where we kind of pick and choose what we're feeding into these models, we can really cater them to specific purposes.
right, right. Well, thank you so much for your wonderful insights in here. And I think that maybe we will even see you a little bit later today, or is it just rumors?
Definitely. No, yeah, I'll be on later for sure.
Excellent, excellent. Well, thank you so much for being with us, CJ, and sharing all your wonderful insights.